So there's something wrong with Teams. It's not recording. It's something happened the last 2 days, and I don't know why. But the microphones work fine, so it's not on my end. It's Teams. Okay, so you are not doing Renaissance art. Because you have to take a different class to do Renaissance art. Yeah, Renaissance art is so important. Renaissance art is so important. Renaissance art is so important?
It is.
Yeah, it's not.
I mean, it was a big trend, but
It's not important? No, it is important. Yeah, Renaissance art would change the world. Okay, so homework. You do have to read 847 to 878 by Tuesday. And that is basically changes in the cities, urbanization, a few things like that. And also, yeah, I'm sorry, Teams, the last 2 days, all my other recordings are fine. And actually, this week, for some reason, this week, it's not, the microphone's not picking up things on Teams. It works on other formats, but not through Teams. And so I might have to switch to a different program to record it and send it up to YouTube. Teams doesn't start working. I don't know what's going on. Because everything worked last week, the week before. There could be chops here and there. So it's something that's happening on the interface of Teams up to the sky. Okay, with that, you want to talk more about the assembly?
yeah.
Okay, we're done with that. Moving on. And so we got, so what I'm going to start with right here is just a quick review. That's what I talked about yesterday. So you weren't here for any of this, right? Marriage and government. I talked a little bit about economies of scale. So you have to go back and look at this. Tariffs is another example. I'm just going to go real fast. This will be in the notes. And immigration would also pick up during this time. No coincidence that immigration from South and Eastern Europe would also lead to the growth of the KKK and nativism. All came at the same time. And, oh, I just showed this map. This is the immigration map. 1900, where most people, immigrants came from. And I'm fascinated by all the Germans. And then, of course, Canada. And we're going to jump right to one other thing is to really try to get more efficient to cut costs in the workplace. That is a way to make money is by cutting costs. Example, that's the assembly line, economies of scale. So let's get right here. The era of big business. So what we have is a domination of big business and this concept of cutthroat competition, which is what the market is. You know, you create a business. You might want to sell your product and have people buy it and you think it's a valuable product, but let's be honest, you want to make money. And you're in competition. In fact, that is the whole element of the marketplace. All things being perfect, competition encourages not only better products, it also encourages innovation and potentially lowers costs, lowers prices, because the competitors cannot raise their prices too much or they go out of business. And so with that, what we have is this era of cutthroat competition, but the big thing is risk. If you start a business, if any one of you start a business on your own, you take all the risk. And if you go out of business, you lose the money. And most people cannot afford to start a business on their own. I mean, you probably don't have $1 million sitting around. You can just immediately invest in a business and then afford to lose it if you go out of business. So where do you get that money? You borrow it. So even if you go out of business, you still owe that money. And it will hang over your head for the rest of your life. This is what we call risk. Starting a business is really hard. Some of you probably have family members who have done it, been around it. You probably know how stressful and difficult it is. It could also be rewarding, any number of things. But there's a lot of risk. A lot of risk. And so with that, competition is the issue of risk. competition is scary. Now, competition is the big selling point of the market. Competition, innovation, all the stuff I just told you about, everyone's trying to undercut you. How do you undercut? You drop your prices. But I think you can see the problem. If you drop your prices too low to undercut your competitor, you can lose money, go out of business. If you don't drop your prices because you need to stay in business and your competitor undercuts you, you go out of business. There's risk. Most people who start a business, let me rephrase that, all people who start a business would like to have this business function without risk. Now, I know by me saying that, you're all going, oh, that's obvious. But never forget risk. There's a lot of risk here. And so with that, there's only really one way to make it a business. Cut costs. You got to cut costs. If you cut your costs, you can drop your prices. If you don't cut your costs and drop your prices, you go out of business. And that must become more efficient. And that's why, for example, the assembly line, efficient production techniques, treat your workers like machines. Have you ever heard the term human capital? That's humans are machines to work and extract wealth from. And since I know a lot about American history, especially that little thing called slavery, that term makes my skin crawl. But people say it all the time. So with that, now you might say, well, cut your labor costs. You can't cut your labor costs because labor, what decides wages? Say it again. Say it again. Well, the economy, what part of the economy decides that? Someone said it. Yeah, supply and demand. It's the market. If you cut your workers' wages, what will they do? Your competitor will scoop them up. Does that make sense? So you can't cut unless you're a monopoly. That's coming down the road. Gee, I wonder what happens when you have monopolies. Well, so all you can cut is become more efficient. The problem with this is, what is everybody else, all your competitors doing at the same time? They're trying to become more efficient. Cut costs. Oh, you can also put out shoddy stuff. Big garbage. Hoping that you can undercut your competitors before people realize that you're putting out garbage. Does that work? Yes, works really well. Not all the time. There's many examples of failures, but it does work. And so, with that though, you got to become more efficient. But your competitors are doing the same thing. But what's another way? Get big. If you're bigger, you have a competitive advantage because you have lower cost per unit that you sell. Therefore, you can undercut your competitors. That's why I always say, you want to know how that works, just try to go start a grocery store next to a Walmart supercenter. And you'll understand the value of economies of scale. You can never get as efficient as they can for lots of reasons. And so, get big. And here is John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. Boy, there's a lot of cartoons of Standard Oil. And they show him that this is a python. And what is he doing? Swallowing up his competitors to get big. So you might notice these. And these are different oil companies he swallows up. By the way, this is obviously against monopolies. What does he leave in his wake? Yeah, I like how they do that. It's clever. So, if you can create something like a monopoly, if you get big enough, you avoid the risk. Now, this is not necessarily good or bad. Value judgments are up to other people right now. But every company wants to do this. They want something like a monopoly. And remember, governments make the rules. This is really important. So, how do you do this? The corporation. Now, corporations are entities, literally a legal entity. Corporations are not natural. They do not grow on trees. You can't dig up a corporation. It is a legal entity. Therefore, it is created by what group? Government. Politicians. They create it. They write the rules. They decide how much money it costs to start a corporation. They decide how big it could get. It decides on where you put your profits, everything. It's decided by politicians. Why do you think they give so much money to politicians? There is a real marriage of government and business. They want this. Once again, there's good and bad elements of like anything else. And this is basically one of the things where all the various things corporations can do, like play with their value of stock to get the value up. If you own a company, you're liable for every penny from that company. You're liable for the debt. You're liable for everything. Corporations are a different entity. Now, there are elements of what's like a corporation. You see elements of this going back to Roman history, even kind of Sumeria, but we're not going to get to Sumeria yet. Unless you want to get back to 3000 BC. Who's with it? It's actually pretty fascinating stuff. But in Belgium in 1830, this brand new country, they created this entity because they wanted businesses to come in. And they took existing practices that were happening in, for example, the Netherlands and Britain, and to a lesser degree in the United States, and they came up with this legal process in Belgium. And everybody copied it. So if anybody's wearing a shirt or something with a corporation on it, thank Belgium. And also, it shows you how dominant corporations aren't they? People pay a lot of money to advertise for corporations. It's kind of fascinating. They don't even have to pay people. People pay to advertise. I mean, Oregon, that's basically a subsidiary of the Nike Corporation. And you know, North Face, Disney. By the way, I like Disney stuff, but yeah, I do it too, because you can't escape it. It just gives you an idea how dominant. What's Oh, okay. Oh, okay. We got Nike there. That was Minion. That's third period. Well, you guys are. Oh, yeah, there we go. But we all do it. So I'm not giving, well, I'm giving a little bit, but not that much. All right, so who owns a corporation? Shareholders. So instead of one person owning it all, it's going to investors. What do? They buy a share of stock. The stock, so they own a little piece of that company. Now, you can have corporations where the sole shareholder is one person. That happens a lot for small corporations. S corporations are called. This happens a lot. Because there's a big advantage for corporations we're seeing. It's a huge advantage. It just costs a lot of money to start a corporation. A lot of money. So by definition, whoever starts this has to have that, a lot of access to money. Another form of capital. But why buy stock? Well, the first one is pretty obvious. If you want to make money, you have money sitting there and you want to make more money. To start a business is really difficult and scary. Remember I just talked about the risk? Why not invest in a corporation? Therefore, you don't have to go through the process of actually running the company. And you can also invest in competitors. And so if one loses, you still have money in the other one. It's called hedging your bets. Does that make sense? That's an obvious one. But what is that little? There's also two other ways. If let's say you own 1% of a company, you own 1% of Partridge Incorporated, which by the way, all invested. You can count on me. I would not get in a horse and ride away in the middle of the night. Yes, that happens all the time, and still does. Big company. You own 1%. At the end of the year, you will get 1% of the profit. Does that make sense? Anybody know what that's called? Say it again. Yep, a dividend. So you could get a dividend, or you can buy stock as purely speculation. Two different ways. Dividends, a long-term investment. Speculation, short-term, where you're hoping to buy the stock when the price is what? Low, and hoping what will happen? The value of the stock will go up. Now, why does the value of stock go up? Is that people think the company is going to make money. Once I sell stock in Partridge Inc., I go public, it's called, and I sell the stock, you give me the money, and then I'm out of the loop. then that stock is bought and sold like any other commodity on the market. What market? That's Wall Street right there. On the market. Bought and sold, supply and demand. And it can be manipulated. People are basically making big gambles on whether or not to buy or to sell or buy. You see elements of speculation. There's a lot of speculation in the 1920s, and it all crashed. There wouldn't be a lot of speculation until they started loosening the rules to try to keep from another crash happening. And we've been in an era of speculation ever since. There's massive speculation. And that's where we're at now. And I should add one more thing. What type of people buy the vast majority of stock? You got to have wealth. It's just logic. You have to have extra money that you can buy stock beyond what you need for basic survival. And most people don't have very much beyond basic survival to this day. They're very little above that. And so they might buy a little bit, but most stock is owned by the very wealthiest people, the most wealthy people in the United States or in the world. But that's just by definition. That's where the money's at. Like, for example, yes, I get a pension. I take a little bit lower pay now, so I get a pension when I retire. I have that right now as part of my job. But my wife and I also have individual retirement accounts, which are mutual funds, which show a little bit in the stock market. But that's just a minuscule amount compared to the big stock. That's just an example. My guess is you might have a couple shares of stock, and I wouldn't be surprised if your parents have money in, let's say, retirement accounts. But almost all the money is on the top. And the biggest stockholders will be called the board of trustees. But trust is going to get a bad connotation, so they start calling it a board of directors. And the board of trustees, the biggest stockholder, so they will vote and pick the person to run the corporation. Who up until the 1980s, for the most part, wasn't somebody who actually owned stock into it. And this comes from Frederick Taylor, it'd be called the CEO. We know what CEO stands for. Yeah, Chief Executive Officer. And Frederick Taylor came up with this kind of complex managerial system to deal with these larger companies. So if you've ever heard of like CFO, Chief Financial Officer, COO, Chief Operating Officer, those are all things created to make companies more efficient. Do they make companies more efficient? It all depends on the company. But they're not necessarily owners of the company. And they probably know nothing about the actual company itself. They're there for one purpose. What's the purpose of the CEO? To make money for whom? For them. So you'd be surprised how many CEOs aren't masters of the actual company. They know how to organize the money for the capital to make money. That's what they're paying. Not always 100%. You see companies, but for the most part, that's it. And so that is their job. And corporations have one purpose: to make money for their shareholders. Period. Once again, no value judgment. That's what you would expect. But then again, that's what you should expect. When they get involved in politics, their politics are to make money for their shareholders, period. So if they do something you agree or disagree with, they're making a guess, this will make money for us. So let's get to why corporations are such a big deal. It's all right, buy stock, whatever. Risk. Remember risk? Corporations have something called mountain valleys. And in mountain valleys, you'll discover, how did I do that? I just clicked it. I know it's silly, it's not that big of a deal, but it annoys me. By the way, in special topics, we are going to do a unit on special or assassinations in American history. So I pull out my Lego book of presidential assassinations. It's all attempted presidential assassinations done in Legos. You're not as impressed as I thought you would be.
Yeah, we've seen.
Oh, I showed you that before? Okay, at least humor me. Aren't you impressed? You're going to go far in life. Did I tell you what we're doing now in special topics? The Cold War and how it affected horror movies of the 1950s. Yeah, it's a fun topic. So with that, what is the big thing? Limited liability. Now this goes back to the Netherlands in the 17th century, but limited liability, you ever say that on a company name it says LLC? That means a limited liability company. And what it means is to encourage investors, but also a lot of other stuff. You as an investor, so this is generic, you're only liable for what you invest. So if you buy $100 into $100 of stock in Partridge Incorporated, and Partridge Incorporated goes out of business, you are only out for 100%. You are only liable, you only have any liability for that $100 that you spent. Any other liability that the corporation has, the corporation is liable for. And what is the corporation? It's an entity. It's not a, well, technically not a person. It's an entity. Do you see the advantage of that? And so now you create the corporation, you, if I start Partridge Inc., I sell stock, I take this pool of money, and then I can invest that pool of money. And who's liable for it? What you invested and the entity. Do you see the advantage? The advantage is huge. Yeah.
So in like an individual business, like if they get big enough and they entice enough like shareholders, like stockholders, I guess, would they become a corporation?
Sure. All they have to do is become a corporation even before you get investors. Is you have to, there's a fee for it, but you have to go through the legal process of becoming a corporation. So that's all it takes. So, a privately owned company can incorporate. Any privately owned company. It just costs a significant amount of money. They can also pay money to become slightly different, a partnership. And that just brings the risk between 1 or 200 people. But you can do it. There's huge tax advantages, huge advantages of limited liability, because this spreads the risk out to all kinds of people. Doesn't that encourage more investment? Because if the corporation goes out, you're only liable for what you put in, so why not invest more? You don't have to worry if the corporation racks up debts, because all you care about is your stock value. You roll the die, it doesn't work, you lost money, you move on. That's why only wealthy people really can play the stock market, because they can afford the losses. Does that make sense? I mean, poorer people, middle class people can do it, but they probably can't afford the losses. So it's a sucker's game. The casino always wins. So with that, but what does this matter? My mouse? You're playing with other people's money. If you play with other people's money, and you won't have to take the risk, if I buy on stock and you choose me as CEO of Partridge Inc., this encourages me to make more investments. Oh, I'm sorry, more risk. I can take more innovation or take risky innovation. This encourages risk. And this is what corporations are going to do. Risky endeavors that would be far too risky for any individual to do, corporations can do. What a competitive advantage. Doesn't this by definition allow them to get bigger? New technologies come around, they might want to take the risk. Doesn't mean they always take the risk. They might also just take other people's money and say, I'm going to build this and pocket it. It also encourages borrowing. If the corporation, aka the entity, borrows money, who's liable for that debt? No, they're only liable for what they put in. The entity. The corporation is liable for the debt. So, if you give me money after you buy stock when I do my initial offer of stock, initial purchasing offer, IPO they're called. But I go public, you all buy stock in Partridge Inc. I take that money. And what do? I use that as collateral to borrow 100 times that amount to build Partridge Incorporated. We're going to build a bridge to the moon. And you bought it. You bought stock. And the first thing I'm going to do with that loan, by the way, is do what? I borrowed 100% to build a bridge to the moon. By the way, am I going to build a bridge to the moon? If Partridge Inc. goes out of business, the entity's liable for that. You're only liable for what you put in. So won't that encourage more borrowing? Won't that encourage massive amounts of debt? By the way, that's called leveraging. I leverage what you gave me here to borrow more. And debt is going to skyrocket. Our entire country, right now, all of it is built on interlocking layers of debt. All of it, everything. Companies are in debt 400 or 500 times their value. They're all in debt. All of them. Yes.
So the thing last year with like GameStop, where it was, they like rented stock and then sold it to try and buy it back lower.
Yeah, that's called short selling.
So what happens to those people who borrow it and then they can't get it back?
They're losing money. They're liable. We're not going to talk about short selling in here. By the way, we are going to do 2008 crash in special topics, and I'll talk about it. It's called selling short. And there's also naked short selling where people sell stock they don't own. Wow, stock market's crazy. And if you start, what you just talked about, that's when you start going into the process of blowing your head up. Because you would not believe how complex the financial markets are. It's crazy. But that's actually, yeah, they lose everything. They gotta make up the difference and pay for it. And so, you have all this borrowing, but you're not liable. And so this allows it to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And one more thing. I claim I'm borrowing this money to build the bridge to the moon, which you all bought, because you can trust me, right? I'm not winking. Okay, with that. Yeah.
That's not what they say where they're like the countries in debt is like invested, or I don't know. This is like going on my head.
This has nothing to do with countries. A country's debt is completely different than a business debt. Completely different. Countries make the money. So it's a lot different. But this also encourages profit taking. Couldn't I take that money and say, well, we're going to build a bridge to the moon, but the first thing we're going to do is, let's be honest, I need a raise. Right? Aren't you with me? And so it encourages profit taking. Scooping money up. So, do you see the advantage of limited liability? It is both arguably good and bad. But it allows for bigger and bigger and bigger. One more thing. If you're not liable for the debt, let's say the corporation commits a crime. Can a corporation commit a crime? All the time. Every day. All the time. All the time. They can, just as people can. So let's say one of you is walking down the street and you have a hammer. And you decide to start beating random people with a hammer. What is going to happen to you for injuring and possibly more to people? Probably happen to you. Yeah. And probably go to jail, right? The legal system's weird, but what if a corporation does something that hurts people? Causes cancer, maims them on the job, kills them. Who's liable? The entity. Do you see the advantage of this? Will this allow you, as the head of the company, to cut corners? Because who's liable? Who do you arrest? The entity. The shareholders are only liable for the money they put in. They are not liable for any crime or any debt. Now, if you can find somebody on a piece of paper said, I purposely did that and ordered the company to do that, sure. Do you think those papers exist? Very rarely. I mean, one of the best examples, I always think about this because when Ford Automotive Company for 12 years made a car that they knew for a fact would blow up if somebody rear-ended it many of the times and burn the people inside alive. They knew that. And they just kept doing it. Because it was just too expensive to retool the factory. They were making a lot of money. Gas prices were going up in the 1970s. You might have heard of it. It's called the Ford Pinto. And the way the gas tank was, it got rear-ended, it would split, and then it got sparked and blow up. Why did they do that? Okay, I'm not even going to get to the morality of this, because to be that immoral for money is hard for me to wrap my mind around. But limited liability. Limited liability. Yeah. Well, so a corporation is a business. But a business could be a privately owned company by one person or a corporation. They're all businesses. But corporations, as you can see from this, have a competitive advantage. And so what's going to happen? Everyone's going to incorporate. Not that this always happens, but it's going to happen. Many more times than you want to think. Yeah. So a monopoly is a business practice. Corporations can't form a monopoly. Does that make sense? All right, so let's get to this then. By the way, these are various railroad monopolists carving up the United States. But let's not forget. Huh? Just go with it. Well, don't forget how much innovation is going to come out of this. I mean, it's kind of a confusing thing until you get a monopoly. Once you start a monopoly, innovation ends. Why innovate? Where are you going to go? So, this is going to lead to massive financial markets. If you have corporations, you need banks set up to loan to corporations, to loan to shareholders. By the way, I'm loaning to corps. That's short for corporation. If you ever see a branch of the armed forces called the Marine Corps, taking a French name and it's spelled like this, the P is silent. It's not Marine Corps. It's Marine Corps. This is just abbreviation for corporations. I'm telling you that because when people say Marine Corps, it makes my ears hurt. I know people say it, but I'm just telling you. It's a French word, basically means kind of a small corps. Back then, they were just naval infantry. So you need this whole system. And here's the thing. Once you have corporations, you can get big. What's the best way to get a competitive advantage? Get big. And so don't forget, these are legal entities created by politicians. That's why politicians rely on getting money from corporations or people who run corporations or big shareholders or investment bankers or things like that. There are reasons for that. So, LLC. One thing though, anything close to democracy, like the United States and Democratic Republic, they fear this concentrated wealth that comes from corporations. They fear it. Why? Monopolies lead to just a power of a few elite. Remember the Tea Party? The Tea Party was not about taxes. The Tea Party was about the Tea Act giving a monopoly to the East India Company for tea. Monopolies lead to concentration of wealth and power. Concentration of wealth and power means if we have a democracy, well, the votes of most people would become less important. The wealthy would control politics. By the way, the term for the wealthy in charge of your political system is called a plutocracy. You might have heard of something called an oligopoly. Oligarchy. An oligarchy is ruled by a few. So a plutocracy is an oligarchy made up of wealthy people. You see oligarchies made up of generals, for example. To give an example of an oligarchy, Russia is by definition 100% an oligarchy. A few corrupt billionaires run Russia. They're actually what we would call a kleptocracy. Do you know what that means? You know what a kleptomaniac is? Yeah, somebody who just steals. The Russian government is a government that just steals. And yes, kind of makes stupid, rash policies like potentially invading Ukraine. But that's another story for down the road, aka up the road, maybe, because it could be happening now. Actually, they supposedly said they'll wait till after the Olympics. Well, that's why states limited size, because they didn't want the wealthy to rig the system. So here is the monopoly controlling all politics and all forces of the economy from a worker with a paper hat. So what did states do? They set laws, a lot of things to limit the size, but the big corporations can't own other corporations. Therefore, no corporation can get too big. If you limit that, and then therefore limit the charters for corporations, the contracts, it'll limit the size. Because don't forget, what do corporations want to create? What do all companies want to create? Something like a monopoly. That is why Andrew Jackson bought the Bank of the United States. He saw that as a monopoly and concentrated power. And that's where you get this weird kind of contradictory history of the Democratic Party, of the Jacksonian trying to help working people at the time. Basically, his concept would have been white men. And then you have the pro-slavery Democratic Party that would develop in the South. This contradiction within the party that would go on until it would kind of blow up in the 1960s. So at that, one of the first attempts companies would get to try to get around these state laws and operate like a monopoly is called a pool. They would create a cartel. A cartel is like a group of competitors who would all come together and agree to set the price. They'll set a floor on the price of goods, with the idea being no one can undercut. We're all going to secretly set the price so we can all profit. The bigger will profit more because of economies of scale, but we will all profit. This is fraud. This is a conspiracy to commit fraud. It was a fraud then, it's fraud now. Yes, it happens all the time to this day. But they happen in the subways in New York. That's why I have a picture of the subway. They all try to set a pool. Eventually, they're so inefficient and crazy. If you ever been to New York, the subway system, that's what I find. There's no real planning. They're all just kind of all over. Because there's individual companies competing. The city would take it over. But they're weak. Because just imagine you have a bunch of competitors together. And they all agree, okay, we're not going to undercut each other. We're going to make money. What's one company? It always happens. What are they going to do? I'll undercut you. And the pool falls apart. That happens every time. Because what are the conspirators going to say? They're going to go to the police and say, hey, that company broke our secret illegal agreement. Whenever you see anything like a drug war or organized crime wars, they're almost always they have an illegal pool and somebody breaks it. That's almost always what happens. That's what's going on. That's like perpetual in poor Mexico right now. That's kind of perpetual. So with that, the next one, trust. Now trust, this is an idea where competitors, the biggest competitor, would convince their competitors to turn over the stock to a board of trustees. Like here, the Standard Oil Company, thus Standard Oil scooping everything up. Now, technically, these companies are still independent, but they turn it over to this board of trustees, which is being run by the biggest company, in this context, Standard Oil. And soon, these will become big, so big that by 1890, the word trust meant monopoly. Just trust meant monopoly. Now it makes no sense, but back then it made sense. And then what's this or else thing? When Standard Oil would go to a competitor's, and this is a small oil company, but he was most famous for doing it to, the best example, we right at the turn of the last century, Kansas, they discovered some oil in Kansas. and he went into these small little oil wells, just small little operations, and in the early 1890s, actually. And Rockefeller's people went to him and said, we're going to give you two choices. Turn over your stocks to the Standard Oil Trust, so we run your company. You're still independent, we run you, or we destroy you. We will undercut you, you will go out of business, we'll make sure no banks will loan you money, we'll make sure that you'll be kicked out of your home, we'll make sure your children will be kicked out of school, we will follow you for the rest of your life. We will destroy you and everything about you. And I have to be very clear about this. He would do it. He was a ruthless man and did not care. So if you're given that choice of being crushed like a bug or join the trust, what would you do? If you did, it all destroyed. And so that's how they scooped up competitors or coerced banks or that kind of thing. Trusts are not necessary anymore, but companies still do stuff like that. And I'll tell you about that. It's called a monospony. I know words are fun. So you get all these combinations where you're going to get companies either get competitors or get all the resources. All these different combinations will begin to develop. Technically independent companies, but run by one entity. For example, there are two different types of combinations we have to get. The first one is called vertical. You see it called vertical integration. This is a cheesy little diagram, but it's a vertical trust or vertical monopoly. Trust and monopoly mean the same thing. Vertical means control the means of production. In this little diagram, it means like, let's say you're a meat packing industry, and you control everything from the farms, railroad cars, slaughterhouse, refrigerated warehouses, meat packing plants, everything. Control from the bottom to the top. That's vertical. It's a vertical monopoly. Vertical integration. Horizontal, it's like controlling all the alike industries. When we think of monopolies, we think horizontal. So for example, controlling all the oil refineries, like Standard Oil will control almost 98% of the oil refineries by 1900. Okay, that might sound like a lot. It is a lot, but that was before the big oil strikes here. And so they weren't quite. They were here. That was the first big spot of oil, was West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio. What's that oil storm? So let's look at these two then, horizontal and vertical. The best examples of horizontal, Rockefeller and Standard Oil, Vanderbilt and the railroads. Cornelius Vanderbilt started in shipping and then he'd make the New York Central Railroad. The New York Central Railroad, if you look up here real quick, ran here. And you can imagine this was the most profitable area for railroads at that time. And they're all independent railroads technically, he just made them part of the New York Central Trust. Eventually a competitor would come in, things would change over Pennsylvania, and yes, all the railroads on monopoly are real railroads. And here's Rockefeller. They show him as Standard Oil, but it also shows him vertically integrated too, because he was both. Best examples of vertical integration, Swift, I mentioned before, in meat packing. He controlled everything from the feedlots all the way up to this distribution of the food. And the best example still would be Andrew Carnegie, who would eventually sell Carnegie Steel to make a steel, would control about 80% of the steel market, called U.S. Steel. He controlled it. He controlled everything from the mines, the railroad shipping the goods, the mills, all the way to distribution. So those are two examples of that. Now here's the thing. There's still competition, but it's operating more like a monopoly. By the way, what's happened to smaller companies? They are disappearing. That's when we get to interlocking directors. J.P. Morgan's now this investment banker, and they're loaning all this money to corporations. Here's the problem. If they're still involved in cutthroat competition, one company might go out of business and he won't get his money back. Remember what I told you about debts. Who's liable for debt if a corporation goes under? The entity. And Morgan is sitting there going, I don't want either entity to go under. And so what he did is this. He wanted to spread out risky investments. He would loan money to competitors and then turn around and say, I want my people on your boards. Thus the interlocking directors. Why? To control cutthroat competition, to limit the risk, to create a pool, but it's not quite a pool. This still happens actually in places like Germany. This is the law. This is the law in Germany. The last thing as the bell's about ready to ring. By the way, that's Morgan. I should add, all these men, and this happens like anybody gets money, it seems like all of a sudden they want a yacht. That's the Commodore's hat. Vanderbilt had shipping companies, so they called him the Commodores. That's why the team name of the school he started to make himself look better would be the Commodores. Or the Commies, which I always find amusing. People call them the Commies. So, holding companies. There is the last biggie. These are illegal until New Jersey. New Jersey was jealous of a certain city. It's still incredibly jealous of that city. You know what city that is. It's Jordan, Montana. And they're obsessed with Jordan, New York City. All the wealth and business there. And so, I hope the notes work. I hope this works. I don't know what's wrong. I'm going to have to set up my other production thing. I have one person to blame. Great. Those cats are starting to overwhelm the board, and they're sucking in the sound. That's science. Have a good day, everybody. Right when you find work, and arguably hang by your thumb.
Oh, these are the best. Notes on the back. I'm ready. A better understanding.
Clear out, people. Oh, cool.
That's what I'm doing.
Just have like one of those like red and blue glasses.
So you're back.
I'm back.
I was trying to fix the camera, so I never came over to talk to you. Were you able to get everything except for? Sorry, it sounds like I'm this whole week.
No, it's okay. This must work for me, so we'll just get notes.
No problem is, you get out a note, if you copy someone else's notes,
Yeah,
you don't know the shorthand.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yep.
Awesome. Were you able to get everything else though? We're good. That quiz, we gotta do that quiz.
I was just gonna say I can come in during lunch today.
Yeah, that should work.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, jeez. You asked so much out of me.
I know.
This is gonna be a quiz. Third period was all messed up, so it's not up. Jim is at the assembly. Really well done.
Thank you.
You got a good example, you led it to something, a few points here and there, but I thought it was good.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah, we're not gonna have a quiz because the third period, everything we blame, I blame all my problems on third period. Unless you want a quiz, I can wing one. I can just ask you random questions off the top of my head if you want.
But I have the questions be about nothing that we learned.
Oh, yeah, that'd be obvious. I think you have that skill set, you're a very talented person, you're gonna go far in life. So, huh? A little bit. If it's over this line, you're in trouble. Did I show you my Lego book of assassinations?
Yeah, you did. And it had if you wanted to do
We're gonna do famous assassinations as one of our topics, special topics.
Did you ever do the mafia?
Yeah, we did. We did a organized crime of the mafia. We did a lot. We did the mafia. Right now we're doing, well, I'll tell everyone. I'm just pointing at my wrist, I didn't have a watch.
Yesterday.
Guys, you should come to the game tonight and play the halftime game. Because I'm like, go up random guys. You basically, you give me $1 and you can go shoot corners. Random game. You get like your color random. Yeah. You can see it. Wow. I feel so. Does anyone want to take my concessions today? I don't want to do it. And I'm not doing it. If anyone wants to sign up, 4 to 6 o'clock.
It wasn't.
Who's gonna be there?
Matt Maria, he's really, really nice.
It wasn't.
And, another person who I don't remember. But then I'll be there for half of it. I'll be there, the thing is, I have to be late. So I'll do it when I start at 4 and I'll be there till 3.
Why would we even be there for 6? I don't even know.
Well, it's
Are you wearing anything?
I'm wearing this.
Like, it's like business.
Yeah, what the heck is that?
He got to make so weird. I don't know.
I don't know. I'm wearing this.
I feel like I'm gonna wear my dress. Because I'm just going after hours.
Most people are going to do, but like when it was animal print, I would do that anyway.
So,
That's very different.
this does.
Yeah.
The only thing I don't like about it is like my big friend might come out of socks. I didn't even realize I grabbed them out of my closet.
But there's two of them.
For the tie. Yeah, this reminds me, and it's so like I have it like. So yeah, this is definitely gonna have to fix. It's like all the same size. And it's like, why is it so long? You guys do so bad. I actually see the back of it. I really like it all the time. Emma, what's on your side? I don't get things. They're backwash. And then they're still I thought I was gonna have to.
All right, everybody, I have good news, followed by more good news. Would you like some homework? Good. You have to read. So there's not a quiz today, but you have to read 847 to 878 by Tuesday.
Yeah,